It's March 2nd, 2026, and oil just opened up 9% in Asian trading. Brent crude at $79, West Texas Intermediate at $73. The Strait of Hormuz, handling 20 million barrels per day, is effectively shut down. Iran's supreme leader is dead. Over 1,000 targets have been hit across Iran. 3 U.S. soldiers killed. Stock futures are bleeding. The Dow down over 500 points. Nasdaq futures down 1.4%. And analysts from Mackenzie, Barclays, and UBS are now warning oil could hit $100 per barrel, potentially even $120 if this doesn't resolve fast. This is Roxanne, and what you're about to see is the biggest energy crisis since the 1970s Arab oil embargo unfolding in real time. I'm Roxanne. I don't sell courses, signals, memberships, or any of that garbage. What you get here is raw data, verified sources, and real economic analysis. Every number in this video comes from official sources. Let's get right into it. We have to understand what happened this weekend, because the timeline matters. On Thursday, February 27th, the US and Iran were in indirect nuclear talks in Geneva. Oman's foreign minister said they made significant progress. Technical discussions were scheduled for Vienna next week. Fast forward 48 hours, and everything changed. Saturday morning, February 28th, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion. Over 1,000 targets hit across 24 of Iran's 31 provinces. Israel dropped more than 1,200 munitions. The primary target was Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was killed in strikes on a leadership compound in Tehran. Iranian state media confirmed his death Sunday morning. The scale of this operation is unprecedented. U.S. Central Command reported striking ships, submarines, missile sites, communications infrastructure, and Revolutionary Guard Corps command centers. President Trump announced that 48 Iranian leaders were eliminated. 9 Iranian naval ships were sunk, including what Trump described as relatively large and important vessels. Iran's chief of staff, Abdulrahim Musavi, was confirmed killed, along with multiple senior security officials, including Salah Asadi, head of intelligence for Iran's emergency command, and Mohammad Shirazi, head of the military office of Ali Khamenei. 3 U.S. service members were killed in Iranian retaliatory strikes, with 5 seriously wounded. These are ground-based forces stationed in Kuwait, according to NPR sources. Iran's response came within 4 hours, which tells you this was pre-planned. They launched coordinated attacks on Israel and U.S. military bases across 8 countries. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, Oman, and Qatar all reported Iranian strikes. At least 9 people killed near Jerusalem, over 100 injured across Israeli cities. In Iran, the reported death toll stands at 201, with 747 injured, according to Iran's Red Crescent Society. Now here's where your wallet enters the equation. The Strait of Hormuz is a 33-kilometer-wide waterway between Iran and Oman. At its narrowest point, shipping lanes are just 3 kilometers wide in each direction. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, 20 million barrels of oil moved through that strait every single day in 2024. That's 20% of global petroleum consumption. On Sunday, a European Union naval mission official reported that vessels were receiving VHF radio warnings from Iran's Revolutionary Guard, instructing ships not to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has not formally confirmed a closure order, but the data doesn't lie. Ship tracking shows oil and gas shipping has largely paused. Only a trickle of vessels moving out, none entering. Let's talk about what happened when oil futures opened Sunday evening. Brent crude closed Friday at $72.48. It opened Sunday at $79.41. That's a 9% jump, adding nearly $7 per barrel. West Texas Intermediate closed Friday at $67.02. It opened at $72.79. That's an 8.6% spike. By early Monday Asian trading, Brent was touching $80. These are not normal moves. This is fear premium getting priced in real time. Mackenzie, one of the top energy consultancy firms, is warning that oil prices could potentially exceed $100 per barrel if tanker flows through the Strait of Hormuz are not quickly restored. Alan Gelder, Senior Vice President of Refining, Chemicals, and Oil Markets at Wood Mackenzie, explained that the key question is when vessels reestablish export flows. He said tanker rates and insurance will increase dramatically, but those costs are only a small part of the oil price impact if flows are curtailed for more than a few days. Even in an optimistic scenario where Iran cooperates, it could take weeks for export flows to reestablish. And during that time, oil prices are heavily risked to the upside. Barclays analysts told clients that Brent could hit $100 per barrel as the security situation spirals. UBS went further, saying it's possible the market is looking at a material disruption that sends Brent spot prices above $120 per barrel. Let me repeat that, $120 per barrel. Bob McNally from Rapidan Energy, a former White House energy advisor, said this is the real deal and warned that if Iran makes the strait unsafe for commercial traffic, oil could spike above $100. Here's the nightmare scenario analysts are pricing. It's not just Iranian oil being offline. Iran produces about 3 million barrels per day, making them OPEC's fourth largest producer. But the real risk is the entire Gulf being cut off from global markets. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar all depend on the Strait of Hormuz to export their oil. According to the EIA, 84% of crude oil moving through the strait in 2024 went to Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea accounted for 69% of all crude flows through Hormuz. These economies run on Gulf oil. Jorge Leon from Rystad Energy told Reuters that the most immediate and tangible development affecting oil markets is the effective halt of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, preventing 15 million barrels per day of crude oil from reaching markets. Some pipeline capacity exists. Saudi Arabia has the East-West pipeline that can move about 5 million barrels per day to Red Sea ports. The UAE has the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline with capacity of 1.8 million barrels per day. Iran has the Gorey-Jask pipeline with about 300,000 barrels per day capacity. But add all that up and you get maybe 7 million barrels per day of alternative routes. If the strait is shut, that leaves a shortfall of 13 million barrels per day. That's 13% of global oil supply just gone. OPEC Plus held an emergency meeting Sunday. They announced they're increasing production by 206,000 barrels per day starting in April. That's higher than the 137,000 barrels analysts expected. But here's the problem. Jorge Leon from Rystad said the agreed increase is potentially not large enough to prevent the Iran conflict causing a spike in oil prices. He explained that if oil cannot move through Hormuz, an extra 206,000 barrels per day does very little to ease the market. Logistics and transit risk matter more than production targets right now. OPEC Plus has about 3.5 million barrels per day in spare capacity, according to official statements. But that capacity is concentrated in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Here's the catch. Both of those countries export through the Strait of Hormuz. If the strait is closed, their spare capacity is trapped. It doesn't matter if Saudi Arabia can pump more oil if they can't ship it to customers. Halima Croft from RBC Capital Markets explained that spare capacity is really only sitting in Saudi Arabia, with the rest of producers effectively maxed out. Everything you bring on now leaves less in reserve. Let's translate this to your daily life. Every $10 increase in crude oil translates to roughly 25 cents more per gallon at the pump. Brent went from $72 Friday to $80 Monday morning. That's $8 per barrel, which means about 20 cents per gallon increase. If Brent hits $100, you're looking at an additional 70 cents per gallon from where we were Friday. The AAC reports gas prices are currently averaging $2.98 per gallon nationally. At $100 oil, that jumps to $3.68. At $120 oil, you're looking at $4.18 per gallon. But it doesn't stop at the pump. Higher diesel costs mean higher shipping costs. Everything transported by truck gets more expensive. groceries, electronics, clothing, building materials. The inflation that central banks spent 2 years crushing could roar back in weeks. ABN AMRO Bank ran 3 scenarios. At $80 Brent, U.S. inflation stays around 2.5 to 3%. At $100 Brent, inflation approaches 3.5%. At $130 Brent, U.S. inflation approaches 4%, double the Federal Reserve's target. Remember, the Fed just got inflation down to their 2% target. A sustained oil shock undoes all that progress. The stock market is already reacting. Oil futures opened Sunday evening at 6 p.m. Eastern. Stock futures opened shortly after. By 6 a.m. Monday Eastern Time, here's where we stood. Dow Jones futures down 537 points. That's 1.1%. S&P 500 futures down 1%. NASDAQ 100 futures down 1.4%. Gold futures jumped 2.9% as investors piled into the safe haven asset. European markets opened Monday morning and got hammered. The Pan-European Stocks 600 index down 1.8%. UK's FTSE down 0.6%. Germany's DAX down 1.5%. France's CAC 40 down 1.4%. Wells Fargo strategists published a note mapping out the downside for equities if the Middle East conflict triggers a sustained energy shock. They wrote that in the event of prolonged Hormuz closure and an oil shock to $100 plus per barrel, they forecast 6,000 on the S&P 500 as the worst-case scenario. That level indicates a near 13% decline from Friday's close of 6,879. They emphasized this is a tail risk case, and their base forecast calls for the S&P 500 to reach 7,500 by year-end. But the fact that major banks are publishing worst-case scenarios tells you how serious this is. Goldman Sachs strategist Dominic Wilson said the equity market's reaction will hinge less on headline risk and more on the durability of any energy shock. If this resolves in days, markets recover. If it drags on for weeks or months, the economic damage compounds. Airline stocks got destroyed. All major Asian and European airlines saw losses. TUI, Europe's largest travel company, dropped 7% in early trade. British Airways owner IAG initially lost 9%. Lufthansa and Air France KLM both fell 7%. Carnival cruise operator down 7%. MSC Cruises is keeping its Euribia ship in port in Dubai due to the conflict. Banking stocks also took a hit. Europe's bank stocks down 3.9%, on track for the biggest one-day drop since Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs in April 2025. The only sectors showing green are energy and precious metals. Norwegian oil and gas exporters Vår Energi and Equinor each gained more than 9% as concerns over global energy supplies grow. Gold hit $5,392 per ounce, up 2.2%, reaching a one-month high. Silver jumped above $94. Susanna Streeter from Wealth Club noted that gold just recorded its 7th consecutive monthly gain in February, the best winning streak since 1973. Back then, a severe oil shock led to a flight to safe havens. Let's talk about China and India, because this is where the energy security crisis gets real. China imported 1.38 million barrels per day of Iranian crude last year, according to Kepler data, about 13% of its seaborne oil imports. Nearly half of India's crude oil and 60% of its natural gas supplies move through the Strait of Hormuz. Both countries have strategic petroleum reserves, but those are measured in weeks, not months. If the strait stays closed, they're forced to bid up alternative supplies, driving global prices even higher. China's position is particularly complicated. They buy more than 80% of Iran's shipped oil. Iranian crude has limited buyers because of U.S. sanctions. But China's large state-owned oil companies have refrained from buying Iranian crude since 2018-2019. According to Iran International, China was already shifting its import mix before this escalation. Beijing appeared to be replacing disrupted Venezuelan shipments with Russian crude, rather than increasing purchases from Iran, even though Tehran was offering deeper discounts. Kepler data showed China discharged an average of 1.138 million barrels per day of Iranian crude at its ports in February, about 115,000 barrels per day less than in January. Now, if Iranian oil is completely offline and the strait is closed, China has to source an extra 1.4 million barrels per day, plus whatever they normally get through Hormuz from other Gulf producers. That's massive demand hitting an already tight market. India faces similar pressures. They import 85% of their crude demand. Any sustained spike in oil prices feeds directly into inflation, which is already a political issue. The insurance market tells you everything you need to know about real risk. Ship insurance rates for transiting the Strait of Hormuz spiked from 0.125% of ship value to between 0.2% and 0.4%. For very large crude carriers, that's an extra $250,000 per trip. But here's the real problem. If insurers stop underwriting Hormuz transits entirely, it doesn't matter if the waterway is technically open. Tankers won't move without coverage. Multiple sources told Reuters that several oil companies and trading firms have already paused shipments through the waterway. 2 vessels traveling through the Strait of Hormuz were attacked on Sunday, according to reports. One was a small oil tanker, which appears to be sanctioned by the U.S. for helping Iran export fuels, targeted off Oman's northern coast. It's unclear who is behind the attack. Marine tracking sites show tankers piling up on either side of the strait, wary of attack or unable to get insurance for the voyage. The Federal Reserve is now in an impossible position. If oil spikes and inflation reignites, they can't cut interest rates to support growth. If they keep rates high to fight inflation, they risk pushing the economy into recession, while households are squeezed by higher energy costs. ING Bank said the Eurozone is the major economy most exposed to the Iran crisis. They explained that the Eurozone was finally emerging from its long period of stagnation, with tentative green shoots of recovery. Now, the region could face an energy shock on top of a trade shock. Europe imports essentially all of its oil and a significant share of its LNG. The European Central Bank faces a genuine dilemma. Services inflation is still sticky, and an oil shock would push headline inflation higher. Yet the growth outlook is simultaneously deteriorating under the combined weight of tariffs, uncertainty, and now energy costs. ECB analysis showed that a 14% increase in oil prices would push up inflation by 0.5 percentage points and could reduce GDP growth by 0.1 percentage points. But that's only the price effect, not the supply chain disruption effect. UK mortgage approvals hit a 2-year low in January. The Bank of England reported 59,999 new mortgages approved, the lowest since January 2024. Professor Kostas Milas from the University of Liverpool Management School said the rise in oil price means the Bank of England will probably maintain interest rates at their current levels for longer, rather than cutting. Since the BOE can do nothing about these exogenous sources of inflation, bank rate will likely remain at 3.75% for longer. European diesel refining margins rose nearly 25% on Monday to their widest since November, hitting $30.75 per barrel, up almost $6. RAC head of policy Simon Williams broke down the impact for UK drivers. If oil climbs to and stays at $80 per barrel, drivers could expect to pay an average of 136 pence for petrol. At $90, over 140 pence per liter. At $100, nearer to 150 pence. President Trump said Sunday that combat operations will continue until all U.S. objectives are achieved, but he didn't define what those objectives are. He told CNBC that military operations in Iran are ahead of schedule. The question is duration. A short, sharp conflict that resolves within days means markets recover. A prolonged campaign lasting weeks or months means sustained economic damage. Christian Schultz, chief economist at Allianz GI, said markets face a significant but not yet destabilizing shock. Much depends on whether the conflict spills into broader regional or domestic instability. The death of Iran's supreme leader raises the chances of regime change, along with protracted instability in Iran, and may reduce the risk of a sustained regional conflict. Markets will likely demand a higher premium, at least temporarily, until clarity emerges on Iran's internal stability and the intentions of its geopolitical partners. Paolo Zangieri from Generali Investments fears a fast-escalating Gulf crisis may push oil above $100 per barrel. He explained that closing Hormuz could cut around 15 to 20% of global oil output. OPEC Plus spare capacity of just under 3 million barrels per day could theoretically offset lost Iranian exports of 1.6 million. OECD reserves are well within the normal range, yet preventing oil prices from breaching $100 depends on reopening Hormuz. The Iranian Navy is likely too weak for a full blockade, but partial disruption through sporadic attacks on ships and mining the strait could push prices to $90 or above. Direct strikes on Gulf oil facilities would sharply raise prices, but also compromise Iran's already weak regional ties and upset China. Saul Kavanik from MST Marquee told clients that if the Iranian regime feels they face an existential threat, attempts to block the Strait of Hormuz cannot be ruled out. He said this could present a scenario 3 times the severity of the Arab oil embargo and Iranian revolution in the 1970s, and drive oil prices into triple digits, while LNG prices retest the record highs of 2022. That's not hyperbole. Historical comparisons matter. During the 1973 Arab oil embargo, oil prices quadrupled. Global recession followed. Inflation spiked. That crisis reshaped the entire global economy for a decade. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the U.S. holds about 415 million barrels, according to Department of Energy data. The government could tap those reserves if prices spiral. But as Kevin Book from Clearview Energy Partners warned, in supply crises, duration matters. A full Hormuz crisis could outstrip what strategic stocks can offset. The White House and Energy Department haven't commented on whether they'll use the SPR. Amazon Web Services said Sunday it was working to fix a disruption in the United Arab Emirates after unidentified objects struck one of its data centers, sparking a fire and leading to a power cut. AWS said the issue led to ongoing connectivity disruptions, but customers were able to reroute to unaffected zones. This shows how the conflict is hitting critical infrastructure beyond just oil. Now, let's address the optimistic case, because I don't sell fear without balance. This conflict could de-escalate as fast as it escalated. Trump has shown willingness to walk back threats before. Iran's new interim leadership might choose survival over prolonged confrontation. Diplomatic channels are still active. The strait could reopen within days if both sides pull back. Oil demand globally has been softer than expected. The EIA was forecasting oversupply through 2026 before all this happened. If the strait reopens quickly and production comes back online, prices could retreat. But here's what the data shows right now. We have confirmation that tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has effectively halted. We have confirmation of the largest military strikes on Iran since the 1980s. We have confirmation of multi-country retaliation from Tehran. This isn't speculation. Ship tracking data, insurance market moves, and analyst forecasts all point the same direction. Supply disruption is real. Duration is unknown. Markets are reacting. Bottom line is that we're in the early hours of a major Middle East conflict with direct implications for global oil supply, inflation, central bank policy, and market stability. Oil opened up 9%, Brent at $80, WTI at $73. Analysts warning of $100 oil, potentially $120 if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed. Stock futures down over 1%. Gold surging as safe haven demand spikes. The Fed trapped between inflation and growth. Europe facing an energy shock on top of a trade shock. China and India scrambling for alternative oil supplies. The Strait of Hormuz is the single point of failure. If it stays closed for weeks, we're looking at oil in triple digits, inflation reigniting, central banks unable to cut rates, and stock markets facing sustained volatility. If it reopens quickly, the damage is contained to a short-term shock. The next 48 to 72 hours will tell us which path we're on. This channel exists to give you verified data and clear analysis so you can make informed decisions. Not financial advice, not recommendations, just the facts. Protect your capital, manage your risk, never outsource your thinking. Markets are volatile, information matters, and you need to stay informed. I'm Roxanne, and I'll see you in the next breakdown.